The light should not have been there. That was the first thing Nora Voss noticed when she caught it at the edge of her vision. A small amber flicker deep in the bare November trees beyond Kettler Road. Not a car. Not a house. There were no houses back in those woods. No trails anyone used once the weather turned. Nothing out there except 2 miles of untouched Douglas fir and the old logging spur road that swallowed itself in a tangle of brush somewhere past the first bend. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had walked this road 6 nights a week for 14 months, and the tree line had never held anything but dark. She slowed to a stop. The light pulsed once, twice, then went out. She stood on the gravel shoulder for a moment, hands stuffed deep in her jacket pockets, sneakers already soaked through from the thin layer of ice forming along the road's edge. It was past midnight. The diner shift had run long again. Earl, needing her to stay through cleanup after a table of 4, had decided to stay until nearly 11 and then leave without tipping. She was tired in the way that settled into the knees and lower back and stayed there. She had no particular reason to keep staring at a wall of trees that were now showing her absolutely nothing. She shifted her bag onto her other shoulder and kept walking. A trick of the eye, she told herself. A flashlight from someone cutting through the woods after dark, some deer hunter who hadn't checked the season calendar, or a car's headlights catching the tree trunks at an odd angle from the state highway half a mile east. Something ordinary. Something with a straightforward explanation that she simply didn't have yet. That was all it was. That had to be all it was. Nora had been in Grover's mill for 14 months, which was 13 months longer than she had planned. She had arrived the previous September with a duffel bag, $180, and no specific idea of what came after. That was the trouble with growing up without a home to point back at. You had no direction to leave from, which made forward feel shapeless. She had been moving since she was 4 years old, placed and relocated and replaced, and the motion had become so habitual that stopping anywhere felt like a mistake she was about to be corrected on. She had aged out of the foster care system at 18 with a garbage bag of clothes, a social worker's card she lost within a week, and the kind of exhaustion that came from 14 years of managed uncertainty. 7 homes across 3 counties, 3 school districts, 1 name she had carried since birth, and a birthday she had always observed alone, because no one in any of those placements had remembered it on their own without a nudge from a calendar or a form. Her parents had died when she was 4. A wet February road, a drunk driver heading north, a collision that the driver walked away from. She had one memory of her father, not his face, not his voice, but his hands, large and steady, holding hers while they walked somewhere. She did not know where. She had tried to find out once, at 15, sitting in a library in her 3rd foster placement, asking a librarian to help her search through records. The file had contained only what was necessary and nothing more. Date of birth, date of death, a case number, a box checked for surviving minor. She had been given the surname Chun by her 1st foster placement, a common enough practice for very young children who arrived without documents, and she had carried it through every home and school and address without question. It had never felt like her name exactly, but names were not the kind of thing you got to renegotiate at 6 years old. You took what you were given and you moved forward. Forward had eventually brought her to Grover's Mill, Oregon, which was the kind of town that happened to you rather than the kind you chose. For 1,000 people in the valley between the Coast Range and the Cascades. A gas station, 2 churches, a hardware store, a feed store, Earl's Diner off the state highway, and a bar called the Mill House that doubled as a pool hall on weekends and tripled as the only available social event for anyone between 18 and 65. The people who had grown up there mostly knew each other, which meant they also knew, with the precision of small-town radar, who did not belong. Nora did not belong, and they had known it within a week. She was not from anywhere anyone recognized. She had no history anyone could locate, no family name connected to any family in the county records, no childhood story that placed her somewhere specific and gave her a context people could use to slot her in. She was just a young woman who had appeared one September and taken the only available job and rented the only available apartment and shown up every day since then, trying to be as invisible as possible. She was good at invisible. She had been practicing since she was 6. At 22, she was small and dark-haired with a face that read younger than it was, which people sometimes used as an excuse to speak to her, as though she were not quite competent. Earl, her boss at the diner, explained things to her slowly and repeatedly that she had already understood on the first telling. Dennis Farber, her landlord, gave her the impression on a weekly basis that she was fortunate to have the apartment at all, that there had been other applicants who would have given him less trouble, though she had never given him any trouble at all. The regulars at the diner called her honey and sweetie in the particular tone that meant not affection but categorization. She was the girl from nowhere, the young woman with no people, the one you left $1 tip because you assumed she needed it more than whatever trouble was not worth bothering about. She had been in worse positions. That was the truth she held carefully, because it kept the present from feeling like defeat. She had food and a roof and a job. She was reading. She was surviving. She was saving money slowly, painfully slowly, towards something she hadn't quite defined yet. The town had decided, without consulting her, what she was. The temporary one. The transient. The young woman who had turned up for uncertain reasons and would eventually leave for equally uncertain ones. People were not unkind to her exactly. They were indifferent with politeness laid over it. The way you were polite to someone you'd been introduced to but didn't expect to see again. Her name slipped from conversations before she finished her shift. Nobody remembered her order, though she had ordered the same lunch for 4 months. When she mentioned, once, in passing, that she had grown up in the foster care system, the woman she was talking to had nodded with the particular expression people wore when they were waiting for you to finish a difficult sentence so they could return to something easier. She lived in a studio apartment above the hardware store on Morrow Street, small enough that she could stand in the center and touch the walls of the kitchen and the back wall in the same motion. One window faced the street, a bathroom the size of a generous closet, 2 burners on the kitchen counter, and a mattress on the floor beside a lamp she had found on the curb. She had a milk crate for a bedside table, a wool blanket from the thrift store, and a shelf made from 2 boards and 4 cinder blocks that held the books she was currently rotating through the library system. She read the way some people breathe, not as recreation exactly, but as necessity, the same way you needed something to hold your weight up off the floor. History, novels, field guides, poetry, instruction manuals, anything that transported her for a few hours into a mind that was not her own. The library was her Thursday afternoon, before the evening shift, and the cardboard donation box outside the First Street Church was her supplementary resource. She had read 3 horse training manuals, a biography of a senator she had never heard of, 2 paperback romances with their covers missing, and a battered Pacific Northwest bird guide. She was not selective. She was hungry. That hunger had kept her going through worse than a small town's indifference. It would keep her going through this. She kept telling herself she would leave soon. She kept not leaving. The light in the woods was, at that point, the most interesting thing that had happened to her in 14 months, which was a low bar, but still. The second time she saw it was 4 nights later. She was on the same stretch of road, same walk home, same time, the sky darker than usual because the cloud cover had thickened and there was no moon to cut through it. She was not looking for the light. She had not been thinking about it particularly, having filed it under unexplained but probably mundane and left it there. She had actual problems to think about and a limited amount of mental energy to spend, and spending it on a flicker in the trees felt like poor allocation. But there it was. Same place, same amber tone, same slow pulse. Deep in the trees, far enough back that she could not have been seeing anything on the logging road she now knew was in there. Too steady for a fire, too slow and regular for a person carrying a flashlight through rough ground. She stopped walking. The light did not go out. It sat in the dark between the firs and pulsed. 5 seconds lit, 2 seconds dark, 5 seconds lit again. She started counting the intervals without consciously deciding to, and they were consistent. Regular. The kind of regularity that suggested something mechanical, a circuit or a timer, not a natural phenomenon. She took 3 steps off the road toward the tree line, and the light went out. She stopped. Waited. Nothing. She walked back to the road, and it came on again. She stood very still for a long moment, watching it pulse at that steady 5-2-5 rhythm, and she had the unwelcome, completely irrational sensation that whatever was producing the light was also, in some way she could not articulate, producing it for her. That it was not incidental. That it was intended. She pushed that thought aside firmly and walked home. She lay awake for an hour. A sensor of some kind, she reasoned. Something that reacted to proximity. But what kind of sensor would be installed deep in an unused forest on a property nobody had tended in 20 years, and what would it be running on? No utility lines ran back into those woods. No road had been graded since before she arrived in town. Whatever power source was sustaining that light had been sustaining it without maintenance for a very long time. The third time she saw it was a week later, and this time it was closer. Not dramatically closer. 20 feet, maybe. But she had started noticing landmarks during her daylight walks, a particular stand of 3 firs growing close together near the road's edge, a rusted wire fence post jutting from the grass just at the tree line. The light had always come from well behind that post. Now it was nearly even with it. She stood on the road and stared at it for 3 full minutes. It held its rhythm, that 525 pulse, and it did not go out when she stepped off the road this time. She moved 10 feet through the dead roadside grass toward the trees, and the light stayed on, steady as a candle in still air. Her heart was doing something she did not particularly like. A drumbeat too loud for the circumstances. She walked back to the road. She went home. She sat on her mattress with her back against the wall and thought about it carefully, the way she always thought about things that resisted easy explanation. Slowly, methodically, stripping away the unsettling parts to see what the facts actually supported. She was not a person who believed in science. She was not a person who believed in much that could not be demonstrated by evidence, because evidence had been the only reliable currency of her childhood. Feelings lied. People lied. Good intentions did not reliably produce good outcomes. But facts were facts, and you could build on facts. The light was a fact. The property was a fact. The logging road was a fact. Whatever was producing that pulse in the dark was doing it consistently and mechanically and without regard for whether she was there to see it. That was not mystical. That was just a thing that happened to exist and that she happened to have noticed. The fact that she had noticed it when no one else apparently had was not evidence of destiny. It was evidence that she walked this road 6 nights a week and paid attention to her surroundings, because paying attention to surroundings was how she had always kept herself oriented in unfamiliar territory. The light was real. It had appeared 4 times in 2 weeks. It appeared at night and responded to her position on the road. It was in the same general location each time, but had moved closer. It behaved in a way that was consistent with a sensor-activated device. There was, according to the local librarian, an abandoned property somewhere back in those trees that had been sitting untouched for 20-odd years. Those were the facts. Everything else was interpretation. She was not in the habit of interpreting her way into things she couldn't afford to be wrong about. But she made a note in the back of her library-borrowed notebook. The date, the location, the behavior of the light. She dated the entry and kept writing the next night and the night after that. On her Thursday afternoon before the dinner shift, she went to the Grover's Mill Library. The library was housed in a building that had once been the post office and still smelled of aged paper and rubber stamps and the particular staleness of rooms that were used but not quite aired out. The librarian, Carol Hendricks, had been behind that counter for 20-some years and wore the expression of someone who had already seen most of what people might try to bring through her door. Nora kept her question simple. She had seen a light in the woods off Kettler Road, she said, and was curious about what property was back there. Carol's expression didn't change exactly, but something in her eyes shifted. She pulled a binder from under the counter without hurrying, flipped through laminated property summary pages that someone had compiled in the 80s, and said, without looking up, Old Pemberton Land. Who was Pemberton? A reclusive man, Carol said. Artist, collector, something of that nature. He came out here in the early 70s, bought that parcel, built something back in the trees. Did not socialize. People in town generally left him alone. He died around 20 years ago, give or take. And the property since then? Never sold. She closed the binder. No heirs anyone could locate, according to county records. It's been in administrative limbo. Nobody goes back there anymore. The last sentence carried a tone intended to close the conversation. Nora thanked her and left. She walked to her shift with Carol's phrase running on a loop in her head. No heirs anyone could locate. That was different from no heirs existing. That was different from the land having no owner. It meant someone had searched and come up with nothing, which was not the same as a complete search. Administrative limbo was a place where things sat when the paperwork was incomplete, not when the question had been answered. She knew that from years of being a person whose paperwork was frequently incomplete. She spent the next 4 hours taking orders and refilling coffee and not saying any of this out loud to anyone. She tried it once, on her break, with the other daytime waitress, a woman named June who had worked at Earl's for 11 years and generally had something to say about everything. There's an old property back in the woods off Kettler Road, Nora said, keeping her voice casual. Apparently belonged to some collector. Been empty for 20 years. June had looked at her the way people look at someone who has just said something neither interesting nor troubling enough to require a real response. That right, she said, and returned to her phone. Nora didn't push it. She recognized the response. It was the response she got whenever she brought up something that didn't fit the shape of what Grover's Mill found worth discussing. She was the transient girl with no background asking about property no one cared about. The question would be forgotten before June finished whatever she was reading. That was fine. She did not need anyone else's interest in this. She needed her own. The week after she talked to Carol Hendricks, Nora's landlord came upstairs. Dennis Farber owned the hardware store below her apartment and 3 other rental units in town and treated all of them, including the people who lived in them, as line items in a ledger. He was not cruel so much as efficient. He told her, standing in her doorway with his arms crossed, that rent would increase by $60 a month starting January 1st. $60 was not abstract. She ran the numbers before he finished the sentence, the way she had been doing mental arithmetic about money since she was old enough to understand that the total always came out short. $60 was 3 closing shifts. 3 shifts she did not have available, since Earl already scheduled her every hour the diner's books would support. She asked if there was flexibility. Farber said the word flexibility in a tone that made clear the answer was no and had been no before he knocked. She closed the door. She sat on the mattress and ran the numbers again, and the numbers came out the same. The following week, Earl hired a second closing waitress. Her name was Bridget. She was Dennis Farber's niece and had, as far as Nora could observe, no prior experience with restaurant work, but she needed the hours, Earl explained when Nora asked. She needed them more. He said it without quite meeting Nora's eyes. Nora's closing shifts dropped from 6 nights to 3. She was not going to be angry about this. Anger at this kind of thing was a luxury she could not budget for. She had learned that before she was 10 years old. You took what came. You adjusted. You did not rage at circumstances that didn't care whether you raged at them or not, because the energy it cost you was energy you needed for something more useful. But that night, alone in the apartment, she allowed herself 10 minutes sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling. 10 minutes of being 22 years old and tired in the specific way that had nothing to do with the workday. Tired of being invisible in a town where invisibility did not even protect you from the smaller cruelties. Tired of not belonging anywhere. Tired of having no one to call. The thing about growing up the way she had was that people assumed the hardship was the poverty. The cold houses, the shared bedrooms, the school shoes held together with tape in the 3rd month of winter because new ones weren't in the budget. Those things were hard. She was not going to pretend they weren't. But the harder thing, the one that did not leave when the circumstances changed, was the absence of continuity. The absence of anyone who had known her across time. There was no one alive who remembered her as a small child. No one who had watched her learn to read, or lose her first tooth, or cry at a movie, or grow 3 inches in a summer. No one who could say, when she walked into a room, "Oh, she's always been like that." No one who knew her history well enough to call it hers. She had spent years in houses where she was a guest who was never quite asked to leave, but was never quite asked to stay either. She had been polite and quiet and useful. She had done her homework and her chores, and she had not caused trouble, because causing trouble was how you lost the bed you had and ended up in something worse. She had been grateful, publicly and repeatedly, and sometimes genuinely. She had been grateful until the gratitude curdled into something she could not name, and she had packed her garbage bag at 18 and walked out of the last house and told herself she was free. Free. She had been so certain that free was the opposite of what she had been, what she had not understood then, and was only beginning to understand now. 2 years into a freedom that looked a lot like going around in circles, was that free without anything to anchor you to was just another word for untethered. You could not aim at a life when you had no coordinates for where you were standing. She got up off the floor. She made her list. She looked at the gap. The gap was wide. For months, maybe 5, 10 minutes. Then she got up, made a list of every expense in the apartment, circled the ones she could reduce, and looked at the gap. The gap was wide. She had 4 months, maybe 5, before the situation became a genuine emergency. That was enough time if something changed. Something needed to change. She sat with that thought in the lamplight, and she thought, without planning to, about the light in the trees, about the property back in the woods, about a dead man named Pemberton who had built something there and left no heirs anyone could locate. She pushed the thought aside. She was not going to build anything on a light in the woods. That was desperate thinking, the kind that led people into decisions they regretted. She turned off the lamp and tried to sleep. The thought was still there in the morning. 3 days before December, she saw the light for the 4th time, and this time it moved. She had spent those 3 days resisting the urge to walk Kettler Road at a different hour, which was the urge of someone looking for something. And she was not going to be someone looking for something. She was going to be sensible. She was going to focus on the practical problems at hand. She failed at this on the 3rd day. She was on the road at 9:30, before full dark, the western sky still holding a stripe of deep blue above the ridgeline. She was telling herself she was walking because the apartment was small and the walls were close, and she needed to move her body. She was almost convincing herself when she reached the section of road opposite the 3-first stand and the light appeared. It was at the tree line, not 20 feet back, not 10, but at the very edge of the woods, low to the ground. And as she stopped walking, it pulsed its familiar rhythm 3 times, and then it drifted. She had no other word for it. It moved without urgency, without the jolt of something mechanical turning on and off. It drifted to the right along the tree line, paused, then angled into the trees, growing smaller with distance. She stood at the road's edge and watched until it disappeared. The pull she felt was not what she had expected, not the nervous flutter she had been managing for the past several weeks. Something older than that. Something she recognized from being a small girl in a series of houses that were not hers, looking out windows at worlds she was not inside of. A particular, unreasonable certainty that something out there was intended for her. She had been wrong about that feeling before. She had been wrong about it in every foster home she had ever entered, in every school where she had spent a year trying to find her footing before being moved. She had learned, methodically and painfully, not to trust it. But she stood at the edge of Kettler Road for a long time after the light was gone, and she could not quite dismiss it this time. She was going in. Not that night, not impulsively, not without preparation, but she was going in. She had turned the decision over from every angle she could find, and the angles all converged on the same point. The light was real. The property was real. The name carved in the log was real. The obituary was real. The county record with the V at the start of the previous owner's name was real. Any one of those things alone was a curiosity. All of them together were something she could not honestly dismiss as coincidence. And she had spent enough of her life being told to be practical, to be grateful, to not expect more than what was directly in front of her, that she recognized the voice telling her to walk away from this, and she did not entirely trust it. The practical thing to do was contact the county assessor's office, hire a records researcher, consult a lawyer. She knew that. She also knew that the records researcher and the lawyer were both financial concepts she did not currently have access to, and that administrative processes in counties like this one moved on timelines measured in months. By the time any of that resolved itself, her financial situation would have resolved itself first, and not in her favor. She was not being reckless. She was being a person who had no support system, no safety net, and a window of time that was closing, and who had found what looked very much like a door. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She chose a Sunday, her one full day off, and went in late morning when the light was good. She wore her heaviest socks doubled over her regular ones, her warmest jeans, the winter jacket with the hood that actually fastened. She brought her flashlight and her phone, the small folding knife she had carried since she was 17, a bottle of water, and a granola bar in her jacket pocket. She did not tell anyone where she was going. There was no one to tell. She crossed Kettler Road, pushed through the gap in the wire fence at the tree line, and stepped into the woods. The sound of the road fell away within 30 feet. That was the first thing she noticed. The way traffic noise and the ordinary low hum of a highway simply vanished. replaced by a pressing stillness that had its own weight. The Douglas firs were old here, decades old, their trunks thick and straight, and their canopy dense enough that the light filtered down diffused and gray even at mid-morning. The ground beneath her feet was soft, a deep mat of compressed needles that gave slightly with each step without crackling. She found the logging road by feel as much as by sight, a slightly wider gap in the trees where the firs grew a few feet apart instead of crowded together. Brush and grass had colonized the center strip, and the old wheel ruts had gone soft, barely visible. She followed it northeast. The woods were quiet. Not uncomfortably so, but completely so, the way places were quiet before they had been much disturbed by people. She walked for 10 minutes, then 15, counting her steps without meaning to, an old habit from years of navigating unfamiliar places by the only metrics she had. At 20 minutes, the logging road curved slightly and narrowed, and then it ended, overgrown by a stand of young alders that had grown across it in the years since anyone last came through. She noticed other things as she walked. The forest here was undisturbed in a way that forests on the edge of human use were not. No candy wrappers in the brush, no old beer cans rusting in the ditch line, no orange flagging tape on tree limbs from a survey that never progressed. No footprints in the soft mud beside the logging track except hers, and those of a deer that had passed through recently enough that the edges were still sharp. The only sign that anyone had ever been in these woods was the logging road itself, and that had been made so long ago it was becoming indistinguishable from the land it crossed. Nobody had been back here in a long time. That was not a feeling. That was evidence. She pushed through the alder growth, holding branches aside, and came out the other side into a small clearing. She stopped. The cabin was at the far edge of it, maybe 40 feet away. The clearing itself was natural, but it had the quality of a room, 3 sides of dense old firs and a 4th side open where she had come through, and the cabin sat at the back of it the way a piece of furniture sits in a space that was arranged for it. Her first thought, standing in the cold gray light with her wet sneakers in the dead grass, was that the building had been placed here with intention. It was larger than she had expected. 1 story, maybe 30 feet across the front face, sitting on a foundation of stacked and fitted stone that caught the winter light and showed careful laying, not random stacking. The walls were log construction, the logs hewn flat on 2 faces and fitted close, the chinking between them intact. The roof was steeply pitched, still mostly whole, though years of fallen needles and small branches had banked against its lower edges. 3 windows on the front face, all of them boarded from the outside with cut planks nailed precisely into place. Vines had reached the lower logs and moss had taken the stone foundation, and the whole structure wore the particular gray of buildings that have sat unattended through many seasons, but the walls were solid. The roof was holding. This was not a building in collapse. This was a building that had been built to last and had kept its word. She walked toward it across the dead grass. The clearing was very quiet. No wind moved through it. The only sound was the distant sound of running water somewhere to the north, a small stream she couldn't see. She crossed the clearing and reached the cabin and stood in front of the door. Heavy wood, solid and straight in its frame, hung on iron hinges that had gone a deep rust red but were still firmly set. The padlock on the hasp was also rusted, but when she touched it, it did not move. She looked at the hinges and saw they were mortised into the door frame, deep and square, the kind of hinge installation that took time and skill. She looked at the door itself and rapped her knuckles against the wood, and it answered with a sound like knocking on a wall. Not hollow, not rotted, hard. After 20 years or more, in a wet coastal forest, this wood was still hard. Someone had treated it. She stepped back and looked at the building again with different eyes. She walked around it. The north side had 2 more boarded windows, and here the ground dropped away slightly, giving her a better view of the foundation. The stone courses went down at least 2 feet below grade on this side, maybe more. That was not a simple slab or a minimal footing. That was a foundation built to carry real load, planned for permanence, the work of someone who intended the structure to hold for a very long time and built accordingly. She pressed her hand flat against the wall log and felt the solidity of it. No movement at all. No give. The west side was a blank wall, no windows, no door. She noticed the wall here was thicker than the other sides. Not dramatically, but measurably. The logs here were stacked an extra course deep. She ran her hand along the surface and felt the difference. Whatever was on the other side of that wall, the builder had wanted it insulated from the outside. The south side brought her back around toward where she had started, and just before the front corner, she found the thing that stopped her cold. Low on the wall, near the base, almost at the ground line, cut into the face of one of the lower logs, letters, small and deliberate, each one about an inch high, made with a knife or a chisel by a careful hand. She crouched in the dead grass and looked at them. She could make out four clearly before the moss overtook the rest of the line. V-O-S-S Voss. She went absolutely still. It was a German-derived surname, common enough in the Pacific Northwest, carried through by settlers who had come up from the Willamette Valley in the 19th century. She knew this. She told herself this. The four letters in the base log of an abandoned cabin in these specific woods matching her specific surname did not necessarily mean anything. It was not proof of anything. It was coincidence until proven otherwise. She told herself this twice. Then she took a photograph with her phone because the morning light was coming through the clearing at the right angle, and the letters were clear, and she was the kind of person who documented things she could not immediately explain. She held the phone in her hands after she took the picture and looked at the image on the screen, those four letters in the gray log, and she was aware of something happening in her chest that she did not have a clean word for. It was not hope exactly. She knew better than to call it that. Hope was the thing that made the drop hurt worse when it came. This was something quieter, a hell breath, the sensation of standing at the edge of a door you are not yet sure you can open. She had spent her whole life being told, in ways direct and indirect, that she came from nothing in particular and was therefore owed nothing in particular. The foster care workers had not been unkind. They had been honest, in the limited way that systems are honest, which was to say they had given her the information the system had, and the system had not had much. She had been a surviving minor from a collision, a case number, a child to be placed. The question of where she had come from before the collision, the family history, the context, none of that had been relevant to the immediate task of keeping her housed and fed and in school. Nobody had told her she came from something worth knowing about. But here were four letters in the base of a carefully built cabin in a forest that nobody had touched in 20 years, and here was her name. She kept moving, looking at every surface carefully now, and she found two more things. Near the door frame, partially corroded, set flush into the wood, a small metal plate. She used her jacket sleeve to clear away the worst of the corrosion and angled her phone's flashlight against it. Numbers, partly legible. A 3 and what might have been a 7. And below them, a single word she had to lean close to read. Private. The second thing was around the perimeter of the cabin, just at the edge of where the dirt floor of the structure met the clearing's dead grass. Depressions in the soil, evenly spaced, one every 6 feet or so. Each one a shallow round dish about the size of a dinner plate. She counted 7 of them as she completed the circle. She crouched at one and brushed away loose leaf matter and found, at its center, a small metal ring set into a buried plate. She touched the ring, and it shifted slightly in her hand, loose but seated by years of accumulated dirt. She knew what rings set into ground plates meant. Hatch covers, access points, below-grade storage, or passage. 7 of them. She stood slowly and looked at the cabin from the center of the clearing, seeing it now as what it was. Not a hermit's shack, not a weekend retreat, not a place someone had built carelessly and then forgotten. A storage facility. A vault, almost. A building constructed with intention, treated against the elements, founded deep, with multiple access points below grade, and a sealed main entry and walls thick enough to hold temperature. And carved into its foundation log, a name. Her name, or something close enough to it that she could not dismiss it without more information. She walked back through the logging road with her mind running quietly, the way it ran when she was holding something too large to think about all at once. She needed to know more about the name Voss in this county. She needed to know who Arthur Pemberton had actually been, not the librarian's summary version, but the documented version. She needed to know what the property records said about the parcel's full history, who had held it before Pemberton, and whether any transfer of ownership had ever involved a different family name. She needed all of that before she let herself think about what the alternative explanation might be. She came back the next day. She had spent the evening and most of the night at her kitchen counter, her phone screen the only light, searching through every online archive she could access. The property tax records showed Arthur Pemberton acquiring the Kettler Road parcel in 1971. The county assessor's records listed it as undeveloped residential land with a small residential structure. No other name appeared in any direct property record. But an obituary archive she found by accident at 2 in the morning yielded something else. A brief notice, the kind that newspapers used to run as a matter of community record for people who paid the fee. Published in February 1987. A couple named Thomas and Clara Voss, killed in a vehicle collision on a county road 20 miles south of Grover's Mill. A daughter, Nora, age 4, had survived. She read it 3 times. Thomas Voss. She had never known her father's surname. Nobody had told her, and she had never known to ask because the name she had been given at her first placement was Chun, and by the time she was old enough to think about what her original name might have been, asking had felt like opening a door she had no way to close again. She had been Nora Chun for so long that the question of what she had been before felt like asking about another person. Thomas Voss. Clara Voss. Nora, age 4, surviving. She was Nora. She was 4 when her parents died in February. She had survived. The letters on the cabin log were Voss. She sat at the kitchen counter with the phone in her hands and the screen showing the brief obituary notice, and she stayed very still for a long time. Not thinking exactly. Something that happened below thinking. The kind of stillness that comes just before understanding catches up with you. Her father had been Thomas Voss. If the Voss family had any connection to the Kettler Road property, to the man named Pemberton, to the sealed cabin in the clearing, then it was a connection that predated Pemberton's death. That meant the cabin's history might not begin and end with Arthur Pemberton at all. It might include people who came before him, or alongside him, or after him in ways the county's property records did not reflect. She picked up the phone and searched for Arthur Pemberton more carefully than she had before. She found a brief mention in a regional arts journal from 1986, a list of Pacific Northwest artists and collectors who had received a small grant from a state cultural fund. His name was there among 20 others. Collector, the entry said. Private. Based in Grover's Mill area. Known for acquisition and preservation of pre-20th century works. Acquisition and preservation. She searched for Thomas Voss and found nothing except the obituary. She searched for Voss family Grover's Mill and found nothing. She searched for Voss and Pemberton and found nothing. But the county records she pulled up, the ones going back before Pemberton acquired the parcel in 1971, showed a transfer of ownership from a previous holder. The previous holder's name in the record was partial, the scan was poor quality and the ink had faded, but she could make out the beginning of it. It started with V. She stared at the screen until her eyes went blurry, and then she put the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She did not sleep that night. In the morning, she walked to the woods with the pry bar she had borrowed from the hardware store's unlocked returns shelf, where Dennis Farber left equipment for weekend renters without much oversight. She was not going to damage anything. She was going to look through one of the boarded windows, just look, and then she was going to figure out what needed to happen next. The cabin was different in the morning light. She had expected it to feel smaller in the way that places often shrink when you return to them with more distance and a night of lost sleep behind you. Instead, it looked more deliberate. The stone foundation caught the low winter sun, and the moss on it showed vivid green against the gray of the weathered logs. The clearing was absolutely still. She went to the window on the south side, the one where the boards looked oldest, the nail heads rusted brown, and the wood surface dried pale. She worked the pry bar carefully into the gap between the board's edge and the window frame and applied slow, even pressure. The board gave slightly. She worked along the edge of it, easing each nail a little before moving to the next, patient, not forcing anything. After 10 minutes, she had loosened the board enough to pull one end away from the frame, creating a gap of about 4 inches between it and the window beneath. She pointed her flashlight through the gap and pressed her eye to the opening. The glass in the window was intact. She had not expected that. Through it, in the beam of her flashlight, she saw the interior of the cabin, and what was there stopped every thought she had been carefully holding in place. The room was not empty. It was not abandoned furniture, not broken-down dereliction, not the interior of a structure that had been left to the cold and the damp for 2 decades. The walls were lined with shelving. Heavy wood shelving, well-built, intact, and what occupied it, in the bouncing imperfect beam of her light through dirty glass and a 4-inch gap, was impossible to fully make out, but impossible to misread. Row upon row of containers. Metal cases of different sizes, sealed. Tubes that were the right diameter and length for rolled artwork or documents. Smaller locked boxes stacked with deliberate care on the lower shelves. And hung on the section of wall she could partially see between the shelving, a painting. Large. In an ornate frame that had aged to a deep gold brown. The paint surface visible through the dirty window was not the work of a hobbyist. The brushwork, even partially obscured, carried the density and texture of something old. Something made by a trained hand a long time ago. A painting hanging on the wall of an abandoned cabin in the woods. Preserved. Intentional. She stepped back from the window and stood in the clearing. Her flashlight was still on. The light caught the dead grass around her feet, the gray logs of the cabin wall, the 4-inch gap she had made in the boards. The winter air was cold enough to see her breath. Whatever was in that building was not what you found in a forgotten structure. It was not what you found anywhere that hadn't been specifically and carefully prepared. The climate, the sealed windows, the treated wood, the heavy foundation, the below-grade hatches with their locked rings. Everything she had seen, from the outside and now from this single small window, pointed to one thing. A collection. A private collection, stored with real care, in a building designed for that purpose and sealed against the world for 20 years. She thought of the Arts Journal entry. Acquisition and preservation of pre-20th century works. She thought of the metal cases on the shelves, each one sealed, each one the right size for something that needed protection from light and moisture and time. She thought of the painting on the wall, the kind of brushwork that did not come from a weekend painter, the kind that came from someone who had trained for years in a tradition that was centuries old. She had no expertise in art. She had no training in anything that would qualify her to identify what she had seen through that gap. But she had spent years in libraries, and she had read broadly, and she had the kind of visual memory that came from a childhood spent observing carefully, because careful observation was how you survived in houses that were not yours. She had seen enough reproductions of old paintings and borrowed books to know what old looked like. What was on that wall looked old. If the building had been sealed for 20 years, and the painting had been there when it was sealed, and the climate control she could hear faintly humming had been running on a power source she had not yet identified, then whatever was in that building had been preserved across 2 decades in conditions that most people would consider impossible without institutional resources. The Pemberton connection, collector, private, based in Grover's Mill area, snapped into a different shape. Not just a reclusive man building himself a cabin in the woods. A person preserving something. A person who had gone to considerable lengths to keep something safe. A person who, before he died and left no locatable heirs, might have received a property and a responsibility from a family named Voss. Her family. The word sat in her mind with a slight foreignness, the way unfamiliar words do when you have not had occasion to use them. She had not used that word in relation to herself in years. She had been told, in ways direct and indirect, that she did not have family. She had been told it through blank form boxes and skipped sections and the particular silence of people who had no information to give and had not felt the absence of it enough to go looking. She had eventually stopped expecting anything different. But Thomas Voss had been her father. And if the name carved into this cabin was his family name, and if the property records showed someone whose name began with V holding this land before Pemberton acquired it in 1971, then she had not come from nothing. She had come from somewhere specific. From someone who had built something worth keeping. But she knew what a carefully kept secret looked like. She had grown up surrounded by things people kept in sealed compartments, feelings, histories, inconvenient truths. She knew the shape of something preserved against the world by someone who understood its value. And she knew, standing in that clearing with dead grass under her feet and a 4-inch gap in the boards behind her, that whatever was in that cabin had not been put there carelessly, and had not been left there by accident. It had been put there by her family, or something close enough to family that the difference might not matter at all. She looked at the padlock. She looked at the iron hinges. She looked at the 7 rings set into the ground around the perimeter, their plates buried in years of accumulated forest floor. She was 22 years old with a mattress on the floor of a studio apartment and $60 fewer per month than she'd had a week ago, and no family, and no plan, and no particular reason to think the world had ever intended anything for her. And standing in that clearing in the cold November light, She understood, with a quiet, settling certainty she had not felt since she was 4 years old and did not yet know she was about to lose everything, that this place had been waiting. She did not know for what. She did not know for whom. But she was going to find out. The way inside was there. She just needed to find it. And she was not leaving these woods until she did. She went back the next morning with more tools and a clearer idea of what she was looking for. Not the padlock. The padlock was old iron, but it was still iron, and forcing it without a key would destroy it and possibly damage the door frame in ways she did not want to be responsible for. She had spent the previous evening thinking about the 7 ground-level hatches and what they were most likely to conceal. Access points for a structure meant to preserve things needed to be usable without drawing attention to the main entrance. They needed to be discreet, functional, and designed for someone who knew where to look. She had found one on the south side of the perimeter, closest to the corner of the cabin, where the soil was slightly drier and the leaf matter had compressed more heavily than the surrounding ground. The ring in that hatch had moved more easily under her fingers than the others. Not free, but with the sense of something that had been used more than once and had kept a degree of function that the others had perhaps lost. She arrived at the clearing before 9, the morning cold and the sky low with cloud. She crouched at the south hatch and cleared away the accumulated debris with her gloved hands until the plate was fully visible. Cast iron, old, about 18 inches across, with a recessed ring and 2 smaller locking pins on either side that she had missed the first time in poor light. She pressed the pins inward simultaneously and pulled the ring. The hatch rose. Below the hatch was a stone-lined shaft, about 3 feet across and deeper than she had expected. A wooden ladder was set into the near wall, its rungs dry and firm. She pointed her flashlight down and saw the bottom clearly, a packed dirt floor roughly 6 feet below grade and a low passage leading north, toward the cabin's foundation. She sat at the edge of the shaft for a moment, her legs hanging over it, flashlight in hand. Every practical instinct she had said to stop here, to take the photographs she had already taken, to bring them to the county assessor's office and start the paper process and not do anything that could later be described as unauthorized entry. Those instincts were the instincts of a person who had grown up in a system that punished improvisation and rewarded patience, who had learned that doing things the right way, in the right order, through the right channels, was the only kind of doing that held up. But the right channels had sent her to a librarian who had closed a binder and said nothing was back there. The right channels had produced a county property record that listed a parcel in administrative limbo with no resolution in sight. The right channels were built for people who had money for lawyers and time for processes, and she had neither. She climbed down the ladder. The passage at the bottom was low, maybe 4.5 feet high, and she had to duck and angle her flashlight carefully to see ahead. The walls were dry stone, carefully laid, the same quality of workmanship as the foundation above. The floor was packed earth covered with a layer of what felt like fine gravel. She moved through it slowly, one hand on the wall, the flashlight cutting a narrow path in the dark. She had not expected the silence down here to be different from the silence above. But it was. The woods had a silence with wind in it, with bird calls at a distance, with the faint biological presence of living things. This silence was sealed. It was the silence of a space that had been separated from the world's ordinary sounds for a very long time and had become something complete in itself. She moved through it carefully, almost carefully enough that her footsteps were inaudible, and the gravel under her feet shifted with the same dry whisper it had probably made for everyone who had walked this passage before her. 2 people, she thought. Erich, during the years before he handed it over. Pemberton, for the 20-something years after. And now her. 3 people, in a span of decades, walking this passage in the dark. The passage ran about 15 feet before it reached a wooden door set into the stone, smaller than a regular door, with iron strap hinges and a simple latch. No padlock. The latch lifted when she pressed it. She pushed the door open and stepped up through it into the cabin. The first thing she felt was the air. It was different from the outside, different from the passage. Controlled was the word that fit it. The particular stillness of a space where temperature and moisture were being managed by something mechanical rather than left to the weather. Not cold, not warm, but consistent. The same temperature in every corner of the room, holding steady. She stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed it in, and what she smelled was old paper and something mineral, like stone kept dry, and underneath that something she did not have a name for. The smell of things that had been preserved past their natural span. She let her eyes adjust. The interior was one large room, larger than she had judged from the outside, because the logs were thick and what looked like one room from the exterior was deeper by several feet than you expected once you were standing in it. The shelves she had glimpsed through the window ran along 3 walls floor to ceiling, built from heavy timber and fitted tightly to the wall behind them. Each shelf was fronted with a thin lip at its edge to keep the containers from shifting. The containers themselves were metal, various sizes, dark and sealed with toggle latches, their surfaces clean, not dusty. Whatever circulation the climate system maintained kept the dust from settling. On the 4th wall, between the door and the boarded window, she had partially pried open outside, hung the painting. She walked toward it slowly. Up close, it was larger than she had seen through the glass. 4 feet across and nearly that in height, in a heavy frame of carved and gilded wood that had aged to a deep honey gold. The paint surface was intact, no cracking she could see, no flaking at the edges. The subject was a landscape, mountains and a river and light doing something complicated in the sky that the painter had clearly worked at for a long time. The brushwork was confident and dense, the kind of density that came from someone who had been painting for decades and knew exactly where to put the weight. In the lower right corner, small and clear, a signature. 2 words in the abbreviated style of a century ago that she leaned close to read. She could make out part of it. A capital letter, possibly an H or an M. A date beneath it, 1887. She straightened up and stepped back and looked at it from the proper distance. She had seen reproductions of 19th-century landscape painting in the books she had borrowed from the Grover's Mill Library. Field guides, art histories, the kind of broad survey text that ended up in rural library systems through estate donations. She had no specific knowledge to bring to this painting, but she knew what skill looked like because she had read about it, and the painting in front of her had skill in every visible inch of it. This was not a print. This was not a reproduction. This was paint on canvas, handled with purpose, made by a person who understood what they were doing. Her hands were shaking again. She became aware of it when she tried to hold her flashlight steady against the wall beside the painting and the beam moved. She took a breath and turned to the shelves. The metal containers were numbered, not labeled with contents, not marked with any descriptive information, just numbered in white paint on the lids, 1 through 47 in a sequence that ran left to right along the shelves from the north wall around to the south. She counted them twice. 47 containers, each one sealed. She went to the nearest shelf and selected container number 12, because 12 was in the middle of the sequence, and she was working on the theory that whoever had organized this had put the most representative material in the center rather than the extremes. She lifted it. It was heavier than it looked, the weight of something dense and solid inside. She set it on the floor and worked the toggle latch. It released with a snap that made her flinch in the silence. Inside, nested in acid-free tissue paper that had gone brittle at the edges, were 3 smaller packages wrapped in cloth. She lifted the first one and unwrapped it with both hands. A ceramic piece. A small figure, maybe 8 inches tall, in a pale green-blue glaze that had the particular depth of something fired at high temperature in a tradition she recognized from photographs she had seen in a library book about East Asian art. The base bore a small impressed mark. She held it up to her flashlight. She set it back in the tissue paper and opened the second package. Rolled canvas, carefully wrapped around a padded cylinder. She eased it off the cylinder, just enough to see one edge of the painting without unrolling it fully, and what she saw made her set it back gently and breathe through her nose for a moment before she trusted herself to continue. The third package held a manuscript. Not a book, a loose document, handwritten on paper that had gone cream with age, the script in a formal hand she recognized as European and several centuries old. She could not read the language. She could see the care in every line of it. She closed container 12 and moved to another shelf. Container 23 held 5 small paintings on wood panel, each one wrapped separately, each one showing its age in the darkening of the paint surface and the small, consistent cracking that conservators called craquelure, the normal aging of old oil paint on a support that had moved with centuries of humidity changes. She did not unwrap them fully. She looked at one edge of each, enough to see color and brushwork, and then she wrapped them back. Container 30 held something she had not expected. Books. 6 of them, folio-sized, each one wrapped in cloth and then in a sealed plastic sleeve that Erich or Pemberton had added at some point, an extra layer of protection. She lifted one out and held it in both hands and felt its age in the weight and the slight give of the covers. Old binding, the kind that used hand-sewn signatures. She did not open it. She was not trained enough to handle old book bindings without risk, and she was not going to be the person who damaged something that had survived intact for centuries. But she held it for a moment, the weight of it, and understood that she was holding time made physical in a way that felt nearly unbearable. She put it back. She kept going. Container 31 held documents. Paper, folded and stacked, and she felt the quality of the paper before she looked at what was written on it. Heavy, cotton rag paper, the kind that lasted centuries. The topmost document was in English, typewritten, dated 1962, and it was an appraisal. She read the first paragraph. The appraisal covered 12 specific items from what it called the Voss family collection. The items were described in careful, technical language she did not entirely follow, but the values at the bottom of each description were in numbers she could read clearly. She sat on the floor with the document in her hands and read the column of numbers twice. The total at the bottom of the 1962 appraisal was $4,700,000. In 1962, she sat with that number for a while. She turned it over. She thought about what 60 years of appreciation did to numbers like that in categories like fine art and antiquities. She thought about what she had seen in the other containers, the additional 46 containers she had not yet opened, and the painting on the wall that was not in the appraisal, because it had presumably been hung after the appraisal was conducted. She thought about what $4 million in 1962 meant in current value. She put the appraisal back in the container and sat in the controlled air of the cabin and let the silence hold her for a moment before she could trust herself to move again. The documents in containers 31 through 35 were where she found the history. 3 boxes of papers, organized by decade, held the records of the Voss family's collecting. Letters in both English and German, receipts from auction houses in New York and London, correspondence with museum curators and private dealers, and at the bottom of the third container, a leather-bound journal that was not sealed or locked, just closed. With a small brass clasp, she lifted with her thumbnail. The handwriting inside was European, formal, and once she had read 3 or 4 lines, she understood she was reading the journal of a man writing in English as a second language, someone for whom precision of thought mattered more than ease of expression. He wrote clearly and he wrote carefully, and he signed each entry, not with a full name, but with initials, E.A.V. She read the first entry she turned to, and then she turned back to the beginning and read from the start. E.A.V., she came to understand over the following hour, had been born in Germany in 1901, had come to the United States in 1938, and had spent the following 4 decades acquiring art and objects of cultural significance from every continent he could reach. Not with institutional money, with his own, which he had made in the manufacturing business in his first decade in America, and which he had then, with the particular single-mindedness of someone who had watched what happened to collections in wartime, converted almost entirely into the collection that now surrounded her. He had not trusted institutions. He had written about this at length, the way that museums acquired and then sold, the way that governments changed priorities, the way that private buyers locked things away where no one could see them. He had believed, with a conviction that read in the journal as something close to faith, that the right thing to do with objects of cultural and historical significance was to preserve them, keep them together, and eventually return them to the world in a form that made them accessible to anyone who wanted to see them. He had been waiting for the right time. He had been waiting for the world to catch up to the idea. He had died in 1978. His name, spelled out in full in the opening entry dated January 1947, was Erich Arnold Voss. Her great-grandfather. She read for a long time in the controlled silence of the cabin. Long enough for the light through the gap in the boarded window to shift from morning gray to the flatter light of noon. She was not aware of being cold or hungry or of having been down in the shaft passage and through the low door. She was aware only of the journal in her hands and the particular quality of reading about someone who had never known she existed but had, across decades and in a very specific way, been arranging things for her. Not for her specifically. He had not known about her. He had written about his son, about the son's wife, about a grandchild he expected, and then wrote about with the particular warmth of someone encountering someone new in the world. The grandchild was Thomas, her father. She stopped at the entry where Erich had written about Thomas as an infant. He had described his grandson's hands, and the way they curled around a finger, and the expression on his face when he looked at a bright object held up for him. She read that entry twice. Her father had been a real person before he was in absence. He had been a baby with curling hands and a face that responded to bright things. Someone who was loved before anyone knew how the story would end. She had known this in the abstract. She had not known it this specifically, and the specificity made it different. Erich Voss had written, in an entry from 1971, about the arrangement he had made with a man named Arthur Pemberton. Pemberton was an artist, a man Erich had known in the circle of Pacific Northwest collectors who met occasionally and corresponded with some regularity. He was, Erich wrote, a man who understood what things were worth beyond their price. He had agreed to be the keeper of the collection after Erich could no longer manage it. He had built the structure, with Erich's guidance and Erich's financial support, and had taken on the responsibility of maintaining the climate systems and keeping the land. The arrangement had been informal, not a legal instrument. A compact between two men who trusted each other, put in writing only in the journal and in a letter Erich had given to Pemberton and that Nora had not found yet, and in a separate document he had written for his son to find. There was also, she found 3 pages later, a passage about the light. Erich had written about it in an entry from 1975. He had installed what he called a signal lamp in the woods near the road, a small amber bulb on a timer, and a simple motion sensor that would activate it when someone walked past. He had done it, he wrote, because he had spent months wondering how Thomas would know to come looking, how anyone in the family would think to walk back through those trees, and he had decided that the answer was to give the woods something worth noticing. Not a sign, nothing that drew attention from the wrong people. Just a small light, steady and regular, the kind of thing that a person who was paying attention would see and wonder about, and a person who was not would dismiss. He had written, the right person will stop and look. They always stop and look. She sat with that for a long time. 46 years ago, her great-grandfather had installed a light to guide someone he had never met through a fence and down a logging road to this clearing. The light had been running on a buried battery system that had apparently been maintained by Pemberton until he died, and had then simply continued because Erich had built it to last, as he had built everything to last. Thomas had never walked that road, but Nora had. 6 nights a week for 14 months. And one night she had stopped and looked. Thomas had never found it, because Thomas had died at 34 on a wet road in February and the document had remained with the collection. The document for Thomas was in container 35. She found it after she put the journal down and sat with her back against the shelves and gave herself the 10 minutes she needed. The document was a letter, handwritten, dated 1974. It was addressed to Thomas Voss, her father, in the formal style of a man who wrote formal things to the people he loved, because formality was how he showed them the weight he gave to what he was saying. She read it. In the letter, Erich described the collection. He described its value, which he estimated at the time of writing at $32 million, and which he expected to grow. He described the arrangement with Pemberton, the location of the cabin, the 7 hatches and the underground passage, and what to do with the padlock key, which was in a safety deposit box in Portland under the name of a lawyer whose contact information he included. He described what he hoped Thomas would do with the collection eventually. Open it. Donate it to a public institution on the condition that it remain intact and accessible to anyone who wanted to see it. And then, at the end of the letter, in a line that was shorter than the others and more direct, he wrote, "If Thomas cannot do this for whatever reason, let it be whoever comes after him. The collection will keep. Buildings built right keep. What matters is that eventually, someone from this family finds what I have made and does with it what I would have done if the world had given me the time." She sat on the floor of her great-grandfather's collection, 14,328 days after she had been born and 4 years after she had walked out of the last foster home, with a garbage bag of clothes, and she read that line 4 times. The collection will keep. Buildings built right keep. She put the letter down on the floor in front of her and looked at the shelves and the painting and the closed containers, all 47 of them. And she thought about a man born in Germany in 1901 who had spent his whole life building something for a family that had been unable to receive it, and whose great-granddaughter had been walking past the edge of his woods 6 nights a week for 14 months, kept from it by nothing more than the ordinary distance between a road and a tree line. That distance was now closed. She had found it. She was here. And whatever it took to make this right, however long the road was between standing in this cabin and doing what her great-grandfather had asked, she was going to walk it. That was not hope. That was a decision. She walked back to town in the early afternoon, and she was different in a way she could feel in how her feet hit the ground. Not lighter. Not euphoric. It was nothing like what she had imagined, in the abstract, finding out something like this would feel. She had imagined heat, a kind of expansion, the world suddenly larger and brighter and full of possibility. What she actually felt was quieter than that. More like the feeling of standing in a room you did not know existed and having someone show you that it had always been there, that the wall you had been leaning against was a door. She also felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific kind of anger that came from understanding how much had been withheld. Not from her specifically. Nobody had withheld anything from her on purpose. The foster system had recorded her as a surviving minor, had placed her, had done what it was designed to do with the information it had. But somewhere in the gap between what was documented and what was true, her entire inheritance had been sitting in a sealed cabin in the Oregon woods, and nobody had known to look for it. And she had been raised as though she came from nothing, because nobody had known to tell her she came from something. That was not rage. It was a fact with a particular texture to it. She filed it and kept walking. She needed information she did not have. Current appraisals. Legal pathways to establishing her claim. An understanding of what happened to an estate that had been administratively unresolved for 20-plus years when a living heir appeared with documented evidence of connection. She needed, in the language of a problem she had not yet solved, a plan. She started, that afternoon, with Dennis Farber. She found him downstairs in the hardware store, reorganizing the plumbing aisle with the slow, deliberate manner of a man who had no particular urgency about anything and intended to keep it that way. She waited until he looked up, and then she told him, as clearly and practically as she could manage, that she had found a property in the woods off Kettler Road that appeared to belong to her family, that the property contained a significant collection of artwork and documents, and that she was in the process of establishing her legal claim to it, and that once that was established, the question of the rent increase would likely become irrelevant. She said this calmly. She said it with the specific plainness of someone stating a fact, not asking for sympathy. Dennis Farber looked at her for a long moment, not with suspicion, with something worse, the patient, practiced expression of someone waiting for an unstable situation to resolve itself without requiring him to engage with it directly. "You found a collection," he said. "Yes. In the woods." "Yes. Off Kettler Road, on the old Pemberton parcel. My family owned that land before Pemberton. My great-grandfather built the structure and—" "Miss Chun," Farber said, in a tone that deployed her name like punctuation. "Whatever's on that parcel, it's county property in administrative limbo. Even if someone's grandmother built something back there, that doesn't give you a legal claim to anything on it. You'd need documentation, a lawyer, probably a court order. I have documentation. Family records, letters, an appraisal dated." He held up his hand. He was not being unkind. He was being the kind of efficient that had no room for things that complicated the ledger. "Rent goes up in January," he said. "That hasn't changed. I hope you find what you're looking for." He went back to the plumbing aisle. She told Earl the next morning before her shift, because Earl had known her longer than anyone in town, and because she thought that counted for something. It counted for a little. He at least let her finish. Earl listened with his arms crossed, and his weight shifted to one hip, which was his posture for tolerating conversations he wished were already over. She told him about the cabin, about the Voss family connection, about the journal and the letter and the appraisal in Container 31. She told him the 1962 figure and what she believed the current value likely was. Earl looked at her the way you looked at someone who had been working too many long shifts and not eating enough, with concern that was really just discomfort wearing concern's clothes. "You've been going into abandoned buildings on somebody else's land," he said. "It's potentially my family's land. You've been reading some old papers and deciding you're an heiress. I have documented evidence of—" He uncrossed his arms. He was not angry. He was tired and busy, and this was not something he had budget for. "Look," he said, "you're a good worker. I don't want anything to happen to you. You go poking around in old cabins out in the woods, you can get hurt, or you can get yourself in legal trouble. Both of those things are bad for you." She understood what he was saying. She understood it meant he did not believe her. What she also understood, and kept to herself, was that Earl was not in a position to believe her. Earl had a category for Nora Chun that had been established over 14 months of her being the quiet, reliable, unremarkable girl who showed up on time and didn't ask for much. And that category did not include finding a sealed collection worth $380 million in the woods behind Kettler Road. Categories were not facts. She had spent a lifetime being placed in the wrong ones. She thanked him and put on her apron and spent the next 6 hours serving breakfast to people who had no reason to think about her any more specifically than they always had. By the end of that day, June had told 3 people, and those 3 people had each told 2 more. And by the time Nora walked home on Kettler Road that night, Grover's Mill had the outline of a story about the quiet girl from nowhere who had convinced herself she had found treasure in the old Pemberton woods. The story was told with the particular warmth of a small town that did not mean harm, that genuinely found the situation sad rather than malicious, and that had already decided, without any particular cruelty, that the young woman was either confused or had found something minor and inflated it in her mind into something it wasn't. She did not know about the story yet. She was walking home in the dark, and she was thinking about lawyers. The county legal aid office was in the next town over, a 40-minute bus ride she could afford twice a month if she was careful. She went on her next day off and sat in a waiting room with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights for 2 hours before a woman named Patricia Elster, a legal aid attorney in her 40s with the practical, careful manner of someone who handled too many cases and had learned to allocate her sympathy precisely, called her name. Nora laid it out as efficiently as she could. The property records, the journal, the letter, the appraisal, the obituary, the name Voss on the log. She had printed what she could from her phone and brought the photographs she had taken inside the cabin, and she spread them across the desk and let the evidence speak for itself before she said anything about value. Patricia Elster looked at the photographs carefully. She picked up the appraisal printout and read it. She read the obituary. She looked at Nora. "You understand," she said, "that what you've described is a complicated situation." "Yes. The property is in administrative limbo because Pemberton died without a will and no one filed a probate claim. To establish your interest in it, you'd need to demonstrate that your family held prior claim to the parcel, or that you're the legal heir to someone who held prior claim. My great-grandfather's journal establishes, a journal isn't a deed." Patricia's voice was not unkind. "It's evidence, but it's not the kind of evidence that resolves a property question by itself. You'd need a deed, or a title transfer, or a probate filing. Something in the official record. The county records show a transfer in the early 70s to Pemberton from a prior owner whose name starts with V. Patricia made a note. That's worth pulling. If the name Voss appears in the actual deed, that changes things. Can you do that? I can make some inquiries." Patricia folded her hands on the desk. "I have to be honest with you. This is the kind of case that requires resources we don't have a lot of here. If the collection is as valuable as you believe, you need a private attorney, a good one, with experience in estate and property law. Legal aid handles immediate needs, housing, family court, things like that. A claim on an estate worth tens of millions is outside our scope. I don't have money for a private attorney." "I know." Patricia looked at her for a moment in the particular way of someone who understood the injustice of the situation and was also powerless to change the structure that created it. "What I can do is pull that deed record and confirm whether Voss appears. If it does, that gives you something concrete to bring to a private attorney, and some of them take cases on contingency if the potential value is significant enough." "How long to pull the record?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. Nora said thank you and took her printed materials and walked back to the bus stop in the thin December cold and waited for the 40-minute ride home. 2 to 3 weeks was 2 to 3 weeks. She had waited longer for less. On the bus ride home, she watched the valley pass outside the window, and she thought about what the legal aid attorney had said. Credentials could be learned. Documentation could be filed. Processes, even slow ones, moved if you pushed on them steadily enough. She had been pushing on slow processes her entire life: school enrollment forms, and housing applications and shift requests and appeals to systems that were not designed with her in mind. She knew how to push. What she had not known, before that cabin, before the journal and the letter and the 47 sealed containers, was what she was pushing toward. Now she knew. She had a direction. And direction, in her experience, was worth more than most things people assumed she didn't have. In the meantime, someone went to look. She found out later that it had been Dennis Farber's cousin, a man named Craig who drove a pickup and considered himself handy in the woods, and who had found the conversation amusing enough to take an afternoon and walk back in off Kettler Road and see what the girl from the diner was talking about. Craig had walked the logging road and found the clearing and found the cabin. He had tried the door, found it locked, and walked around the building twice. He had not seen the ground-level hatches because he had not known to look for them, and the dead grass and leaf matter concealed them well. He had tried to look through the boarded windows and seen nothing, because the boards were flush and well-nailed, and Nora had carefully replaced the one she had partially pried open. He had reported back to Farber that it was just an old locked-up shack in the woods. Nothing remarkable. No sign of any collection. Just a weathered building that probably had a dead raccoon inside, and nothing else. Farber told Earl. Earl mentioned it to June. June, who had already told most of the diner's regular customers the outline of Nora's claim, added this detail to the story. The girl from nowhere had found an abandoned shack in the woods and convinced herself it was a treasure vault. The shack had been checked, and it was just a shack. Nora heard this on a Tuesday evening when she came in for her shift and found 3 of the regulars exchanging the story with the comfortable warmth of people who had reached a conclusion they found satisfying. They did not lower their voices when she came in. The story was not being told maliciously. It was being told the way people told small-town stories about harmless, confused people, with a kind of affectionate condescension that assumed its subject could not hear the condescension inside the affection. She took her apron from its hook and tied it around her waist, and went out to the floor and took the first table's order and did not say anything. By the end of that week, she had heard the story in 3 different versions. In the first version, she had found an old cabin and become convinced it was full of gold. In the second version, she had been going into the woods at night and acting strange. In the third version, and this one had a particular sharpness to it that the others lacked, she was not confused at all. She was running some kind of scam, trying to claim property that wasn't hers, probably looking for a way out of paying rent. She heard that third version from a woman at table 6 who did not know she was within earshot, and she finished taking the order, wrote it down correctly, went back to the kitchen, and stood at the pass-through window for 30 seconds doing nothing. She was not running a scam. She was a person who had found something that belonged to her family and was trying, against the specific resistance of having no money and no standing and no one in this town who believed her, to do something about it. She was not going to defend herself to people who had already decided. She had learned, over 14 years of being assessed and placed and reviewed by systems and people who had made up their minds before she walked into the room, that defending yourself against a decided verdict was an expenditure that rarely changed anything. What changed things was evidence. What changed things was the kind of fact that could not be reinterpreted by someone with a preferred conclusion. She was going to find that fact, not because there was nothing to say, because there was no point in saying it here, to these people, in this room. She had photographs. She had a 1962 appraisal in her notebook. She had a letter from her great-grandfather to her father. She had the journal of a man who had spent 40 years building something and had trusted the future to receive it. Craig had seen the outside of a locked building and reported back that nothing was inside. The fact that he had not found the underground entrance did not mean the underground entrance did not exist. It meant Craig had not been looking carefully enough. That was not her problem. That was his. She went back to the cabin that Saturday, earlier than usual, before the light had fully filled the clearing. She had been back 4 times since the first entry, each time spending more of her limited flashlight battery, carefully working through the containers and the documents, logging everything she could in the back pages of a spare notebook she had bought from the hardware store. Container numbers and brief descriptions and estimated dimensions. She was building an inventory the way her great-grandfather had built his collection, one careful entry at a time. On this visit, she went directly to Container 35, where she had found her father's letter, and looked through the remaining documents she had not yet fully examined. Most were administrative, receipts and correspondence, and insurance filings. The insurance filings in particular held her attention for a long time. The most recent filing was dated 1976, 2 years before Erich Voss had died. It covered the collection against loss and damage and listed individual items by lot number and assessed value. The total insured value on the 1976 document was $44,300,000. In 1976, she sat with that number the way she had sat with the 1962 number, turning it over, trying to apply the logic of compound appreciation to it across nearly 50 years of fine art market growth. She had looked this up after the first appraisal, on her phone in the apartment late at night with her data nearly depleted. The fine art market had grown at roughly 7 to 8% annually over the long term, with significant peaks in certain categories. An insured value of $44 million in 1976, applied to that growth rate over 5 decades, reached a number she had written in her notebook and then stared at for several minutes before she trusted it enough to leave on the page. The number was in the high 300s of millions. Conservative estimates, given what she had seen in the containers. She was sitting in the middle of roughly $380 million. She put the insurance document back in the container and closed the lid and sat in the silence for a while. Then she went back to container 35 and looked at the final item she had not yet examined, a small sealed envelope at the bottom of the stack, placed under everything else as though it had been put there last. It was addressed in handwriting different from Erich's. Smaller, more hurried, more recent. The paper of the envelope was not as aged as the documents around it. The name on the envelope was not Thomas. It was Nora. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. The handwriting was not her great-grandfather's. It was someone else's. Someone who had been in this cabin after Erich had died in 1978, after the collection had been sealed in Pemberton's care. Someone who had placed an envelope with her name on it in the bottom of the stack, knowing she would eventually find it, knowing she would have to work through the containers to reach it, knowing that by the time she found it she would understand enough of the context to read it properly. Pemberton. It had to be Pemberton. The man who had kept the collection for 20-plus years, who had built this structure and maintained it, and stayed in Grover's Mill through the 70s and 80s and 90s until he died, waiting, in his own way, for the family that did not come. She picked up the envelope. Her name in a stranger's handwriting, placed here for her in a cabin she had not known existed until a light in the woods pulled her through a fence and down a logging road. The envelope was sealed. She held it in both hands in the controlled air of the cabin, surrounded by 47 containers and one painting and the journal of a man who had been dead since before her parents met, and she thought about all the ways a life could be rearranged in a single afternoon. She did not open it yet. She needed to be outside for this. She needed the sky above her and the cold air and the ordinary ground of the clearing before she read what a dead man had left for a girl he had never met but had apparently believed in enough to write her name down and seal it in an envelope and place it where she would find it when she was ready. She climbed back through the passage and up the ladder and emerged into the clearing and sat in the dead grass with her back against the cold stone of the cabin's foundation. The clearing was absolutely still. No wind. The firs stood close around it on 3 sides like walls of something larger, and the sky above was a flat winter white, and somewhere to the north the small stream was running, barely audible. She thought about Pemberton for a moment. She had not thought about him much as a person, only as a name in a property record, as the man who had kept the collection and then died without resolving what became of it. But he had been here, in this clearing, for over 2 decades. He had come out here to check the climate systems and maintain the hatches and make sure the seal on the door was holding. He had done this without anyone in town knowing why, because people in town had simply accepted that the reclusive man who lived off Kettler Road did reclusive man things in the reclusive man's woods. He had known the family he was waiting for would not come the way families usually came, through announcement and lawyers and formal process. They would come the way lost things came back, by the slow gravity of what had been lost pulling toward what had been left. He had trusted that, and when he knew he was dying, he had written the letter and placed it where it needed to be. He had kept faith with a dead man's wish for 20 years, alone, without credit, and when he ran out of time, he had made the only provision still available to him. She turned the envelope over in her hands. Her name, in a careful hand. The seal was intact. She opened it. The letter inside was a single page, folded twice. She unfolded it and read the date at the top, March 1999. Written 6 months before Arthur Pemberton died, according to the county records that listed his death in September of that year. The letter began, "To Nora Voss, if she ever finds this place, which I believe she will, because the collection does not give up on its family, and its family does not give up on it, even when they don't know what they're looking for." She stopped reading and looked at the sky for a moment. He had known her name. Pemberton had known her name. That meant that after her parents had died in 1987, he had looked. He had found the surviving daughter listed in the accident report or an obituary, and he had known she existed, and he had put her name on an envelope and kept it here, waiting. He had been watching for her, in his own quiet way, for 12 years before he died. She looked back at the letter. The second paragraph began, "There is a woman in Portland who has been waiting. She was a close friend of your great-grandfather and has kept certain documents he could not keep here. Her name is—" Nora stopped again, because the name on the next line was a name she recognized, though she could not immediately place from where. A distinctive name, old-fashioned, the kind you remembered if you had ever heard it. She read it a second time to make sure she had it right. She had seen that name. Not in person, not in conversation, but somewhere in the research she had been doing in the small hours of the night, somewhere in the archive of Pacific Northwest cultural history she had been working through on her phone. A name attached to an institution or a foundation or an organization that worked with art and cultural preservation. The letter said the woman was in her 80s now and had been asking for 20 years whether anyone from the Voss family had come to claim what Erich had left. The letter said she had information that would resolve the legal questions, documentation that would establish Nora's claim without ambiguity, and a story to tell about a man who had spent his life building something beautiful and had trusted the future to receive it. And at the end of the letter, in a final paragraph that was the plainest thing Pemberton had written, "The collection is worth a great deal of money, and that will matter when the lawyers arrive. But what it is worth in money is not why I kept it. It is not why Erich built it. What you are holding is evidence that some people spend their whole lives trying to give the world something permanent, something that holds past their own span, something that other people can come to when they need proof that beauty was made and kept. That is not a small thing. That is everything. I kept it for you. I kept it for Erich. I kept it for all the people who should have the chance to stand in front of what a human being can make when they pour everything into it. Now it is yours. Go find her. She is waiting." Nora sat in the clearing for a long time after she finished reading. The clearing held its stillness. The sky held its flat winter white. The cabin behind her held its 47 containers and its painting and its 46 years of patient, careful keeping. She folded the letter back into the envelope and put it in her jacket pocket, and she thought about the bus to Portland and what it cost and how many shifts she would need to cover it and what she was going to say when she knocked on a door and introduced herself to a woman in her 80s who had been waiting for her for 20 years. She thought about Dennis Farber in his plumbing aisle, telling her she had no claim. She thought about Earl looking at her with that careful, tired pity. She thought about the stories circulating in the diner about the confused girl from nowhere who had talked herself into believing a locked shack was a treasure vault. She thought about every person who had looked at her across the years and seen someone with no background, no family, no story worth telling. She pulled her notebook out of her jacket and looked at the inventory she had been building, page after careful page of container numbers and descriptions and dimensions, and the sums she had been running. Then she stood up. All Nora had to do was go to Portland and find her. All Nora had to do was walk into the life that had been waiting for her, sealed and preserved and held carefully against the world for longer than she had been alive. She had 47 containers of reasons to do exactly that. She looked at the cabin one more time before she walked back through the trees. The stone foundation, the solid logs, the steep pitched roof holding its ground against 46 winters. A building built to last. Her great-grandfather had said that in a letter to a son who never found it. Buildings built right keep. She had found it. She was going to Portland. And whatever Grover's Mill thought of the quiet girl from nowhere who worked the diner closing shift and read books on her breaks, and had started acting strange about some old shack in the woods, they were about to find out what it looked like, when someone who had been told her whole life that she came from nothing discovered she had been wrong about that all along. The bus to Portland left Grover's Mill at 6:15 on a Thursday morning, and Nora was on it with $40 in her wallet, the letter from Pemberton, the photographs from her phone printed at the library the previous afternoon, and the notebook that now held 11 pages of inventory. She had told Earl she needed a personal day. She had not told him why, and he had not asked, because Earl had by this point filed Nora's situation under-resolved in his mind. The girl had had a strange couple of weeks. She had calmed down. Everything was fine. She sat at the window and watched Grover's mill disappear behind the first bend of the highway, and she did not feel what she had expected to feel about leaving. She had expected some version of relief or apprehension, or the particular emotion that came from moving towards something you had been working toward for a long time. What she felt instead was very quiet. The kind of quiet that came after a decision had been fully made and there was nothing left to do but move through it. The highway unrolled west and then south through the valley, and the December light came in low through the scratched bus window, and Nora held the envelope in both hands on her lap and looked at it and thought about a man named Arthur Pemberton who had lived alone in a small town for most of his adult life, keeping a secret that was not his to keep but that he had kept anyway, waiting for people who never came, and who had still, in the last months of his life, found the energy to write an envelope with a name on it and place it where it needed to be. She thought about that kind of patience. She had been thinking about it since the moment she found the letter, and she was still thinking about it now, 40 minutes into a bus ride that was carrying her toward the end of the longest 46-year chain of careful keeping she had ever encountered. The valley was brown and silver in the winter light. She watched it pass. She thought about all the mornings in Grover's mill when she had woken up on the mattress on the floor and run through the numbers and come out the same way she always did, which was not enough. She thought about 14 months of closing shifts and $60 shortfalls and the particular exhaustion of living at the edge of what was manageable without anyone to share the weight of it. She thought about the woman at table 6 and the easy, affectionate condescension of people who thought they understood her because they had categorized her, in the way that kind of understanding did not see you at all. Then she thought about what was in the notebook on her lap. She had made a list on one of the blank back pages, at some point in the past month, of everything she knew about Erich Arnold Voss. Born in Weimar, Germany, 1901. Emigrated to the United States in 1938, the year before the war began in earnest, carrying whatever he could carry. Built a manufacturing business in Portland. Spent 4 decades converting that business into a collection, one careful acquisition at a time. Designed a structure to hold it. Designed a signal lamp to guide his family to it. Wrote a letter to his son that his son never found. Died in 1978, trusting the future to receive what he had made. She had thought about him often in the weeks since she found the letter. Not with sentiment exactly, but with the particular attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. What kind of person built that way? What kind of faith in the future could sustain 40 years of careful, solitary preparation for people who might never come? She thought she understood it, in the way you could understand something you had never directly experienced because it rhymed with something smaller in your own life. She had been preparing, in her own limited way, for her entire life. Preparing to survive, preparing to leave, preparing to be somewhere else, preparing to be someone else. Preparing, without being entirely sure what she was preparing for. She had found what she was preparing for. She thought about the road at midnight and the light in the trees. She thought about the clearing and the cabin and the 47 containers and a great-grandfather she had never met who had built a signal lamp so that his family would stop and look. She had stopped. She had looked. The bus kept going south, and somewhere behind it in the valley, in the woods off Kettler Road, the cabin sat in its clearing with its hatches sealed and its climate control running and its signal lamp dark, having done everything that had been asked of it. Portland was 40 minutes from the bus depot to the address she had found in Pemberton's letter, via 2 transfers she had mapped the night before. The city felt different from the one she remembered passing through at 19. Larger, denser, more layered. The kind of place where you could spend a year in one neighborhood and still find things you had not seen. She followed the map. The address was in a neighborhood of older houses on the west side, streets that climbed the hill in long curves past tall trees, and houses built in the 20s and 30s with the particular solidity of structures designed to last. She found the house at the end of a short block, a craftsman bungalow with a wide covered porch, the garden in winter dormancy but clearly tended, a light on inside. She stood on the front path for a moment. Pemberton had written, in 1999, that Clara Brandt was in her 80s. That had been 25 years ago. Clara would now be over 100 years old, if she was alive at all. The letter had not promised she would be. It had said she was waiting, which was not the same as a promise. Nora had found, in her late-night research on her phone, a reference to a Clara Brandt in the archives of the Pacific Northwest Cultural Heritage Foundation, where a small gallery had been named in her honor. The listing was 20 years old. Whether Clara was alive was something she would only know when she knocked. She knocked. The door was opened by a woman in her mid-60s with close-cut silver hair and the alertness of someone who had spent years being the person people came to with difficult things. She looked at Nora without the wariness most people showed to strangers at the door. She looked at her the way you looked at someone you had been half expecting. "I'm looking for Clara Brandt," Nora said. The woman's expression shifted, something between grief and recognition that happened quickly and settled. "My grandmother," she said. "She passed away 7 years ago, but she left instructions. She left them very specifically. She told me about you." Nora held very still. "Not you exactly. She told me about whoever would come. About the girl with the Voss name who would eventually find the cabin and read the letter and come to Portland. She described you in a general way. She said she would be young, that she would have grown up without knowing her family, and that when she came she would look tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep." The woman held the door wider. "I'm her granddaughter," she said. "My name is Renata. Please come inside." The house was full of books and photographs and the warmth of a space that had been lived in by the same person for a very long time and still held that person's shape even after she was gone. Renata made tea without asking and set it on the kitchen table, and then she brought out a locked metal box that was old and well-used and placed it in the center of the table between them. "She told me to give this to the Voss heir," Renata said. "She checked the locks twice every year until she couldn't anymore. Then I did it for her." "What's in it?" Renata sat down across from her. "Everything you need," she said, and provided the key on a small ring and pushed the box across. The box held 4 items. The first was a sealed envelope marked Deed of Trust, with the name of a Portland law firm and a date in 1972. The second was a handwritten document in German with a typed English translation stapled behind it. The third was a set of old color photographs from the early 70s, showing a man she did not recognize standing in front of the cabin beside a woman who was clearly young and clearly Clara, both of them looking at something in the building's construction, the older man explaining and the young woman memorizing. The fourth was a letter with a broken seal, addressed to whoever came after. She read the deed of trust first. It was a legal document, properly executed and witnessed in 1972, establishing a trust for the Voss family collection with Erich Arnold Voss as the founding trustee, Arthur Pemberton as secondary trustee, and in the event of both their deaths, the trust to pass to the nearest living Voss heir. A Portland attorney named Gordon Hayes was listed as administering counsel. The terms were clearly set out in language that had been drafted with precision by someone who understood that the document would need to hold across decades without interpretation. She read the relevant passage twice to make sure she had understood it correctly. The nearest living Voss heir. That was her. She put the document back on the table and sat with the fact of it for a moment. Renata was watching her, not pushing, giving her the space to absorb at whatever pace was required. "My grandmother said the hardest part would not be proving the claim," Renata said eventually. "She said the legal structure was sound and always had been. She said the hardest part would be convincing you that you deserved it. That you had been told for so long that you came from nothing that you might not be able to fully believe you came from everything." Nora looked at the document in front of her, at the name Erich Arnold Voss, her great-grandfather, and the date 1972, the year before she was born. "Tell me about your grandmother," she said. Clara Brandt had met Erich Voss in 1946, when she was a young woman newly arrived in Portland from Germany and working at an auction house that handled estate sales and private collections. Erich had come in to authenticate a piece he was considering, and they had argued for 2 hours over a provenance question, and he had been right, and she had said so, and they had been friends from that day forward for more than 3 decades. She had watched him build the collection. She had helped in the early years with translations and correspondence, and the specific knowledge of European art markets she had brought with her. She had been there when he made the arrangement with Pemberton, when the plans for the cabin were drawn, when the collection was sealed and handed over to its keeper. She had also been there in the years before that, Renata said, when Erich was still building actively. She went with him sometimes to auctions and private sales. She helped him understand the market for things he was not expert in himself. She remembered, she told my grandmother once, watching him buy a 16th-century illuminated manuscript from a private collection in New York and wrap it himself and carry it onto the plane in his lap because he did not trust it to the hold. He said it had survived 500 years of human carelessness, and he was not going to be the one who ended the streak. Nora almost smiled at that. She was there when Erich got the news about Thomas, Renata continued, her voice quieter. She said it was the only time she had seen him sit down in the middle of a workday and not get up again for several hours. He did not cry, she said, which she understood by then was how he was. He sat very still, and eventually he said, "Someone will find what I have made. Someone from this family." He said it the same way he said everything, as though it was a practical fact rather than a hope. She had been there in 1987 when Thomas and Clara Voss died on a county road in February, and she had carried that knowledge ever since, asking through legal channels whether anyone had come forward, watching for a name in public records, checking the metal box every year as a kind of ritual affirmation that what had been kept would still be found. Nobody came. For 15 years she asked, and nobody came. And then she was too old and unwell to ask anymore, and she gave the responsibility to her granddaughter and told her exactly what to do when the time came. She knew Thomas had a daughter, Renata said. She found the birth record after the accident. Nora Voss, age 4. She tried for years to find where the girl had gone, but the foster placement records were sealed, and by the time she found a pathway to access them, she was very old, and the girl had aged out of the system and vanished into the ordinary world with a different name. She never found me, Nora said. She never found you, Renata confirmed. But she believed you would find us. She was completely certain of it. She used to say the collection had a way of calling its family home. She thought of the signal lamp the way she thought of a lot of things Erich had done, as faith made physical, practical, something you could see and measure and maintain. Every time she checked the box, she said the same thing. It will still be there when the girl comes. She was right, Nora said. Renata nodded. She was right about most things. Nora turned to one of the photographs. The young Clara and the older Erich, both looking at something in the cabin's construction. A man explaining a thing to a woman who was going to remember it. Two people who understood what they were trying to preserve and why. She had no photographs of her father at this age. She had no photographs of her father at any age. But she had this. A picture of a man who had trusted the future with everything he had made, standing in front of the building he had designed for it, explaining it to someone who would carry it forward after him. She thought about the kind of person who built that way, and the kind of faith it required, and the specific loneliness of doing it without knowing whether the future you were building for would ever actually arrive. He had done it anyway. He had done it for 40 years, without certainty, because he believed the work was right regardless of whether the outcome came in his lifetime. She set the photograph back on the table. "Can you introduce me to the attorney?" she said. Renata almost smiled. "My grandmother had me call the firm every year on her behalf," she said. She said to tell them that when the heir arrived, she would be young and prepared and should be taken seriously and not be made to wait. She said that quite firmly. She was quite firm about most things. The law firm occupied a floor in a building downtown, and the attorney who had administered the Voss family trust for 15 years was a woman named Patricia Solis, with the particular competence of someone who handled complicated things and did not feel the need to perform complexity for the client. She had the file when Nora arrived. She walked her through the legal structure step by step, with the clarity of someone who had learned to explain difficult things to overwhelmed people without condescension. The trust was intact. The deed to the Kettler Road parcel had been held in the trust since 1972. The county's designation of the property as administratively unresolved was, technically, incorrect. The property had never been unclaimed. It had been held in trust, quietly paying its own nominal property taxes through an automated account Erich had funded before his death. "We'll need to verify your identity formally," Patricia said. "Birth records, the foster care connection, the name change, the original Voss birth certificate." She paused. "I'd also recommend an independent appraisal of the collection before we proceed. The insurance documentation is compelling, but it's dated. For probate purposes, we need a current certified appraisal. How long does this take?" Patricia looked at her carefully. 6 to 8 weeks for identity verification and the formal claim, if everything proceeds without complication. She made a note. I want to ask you something. Go ahead. You've been carrying this alone for several weeks. You went to a legal aid office and encountered skepticism, and you came here on your own today. Why didn't you bring someone with you? There's no one, Nora said. It was the simple true answer. Patricia wrote something down. That changes now. She said, you're not going to navigate this alone. I'm going to tell you at every stage exactly what is happening and why. She closed the file. The instruction from the attorney who administered this trust before me was very clear. When the heir arrives, make it right. Make it complete. Don't let the process swallow the person. She extended her hand across the desk. Welcome, she said. It's taken a long time for you to get here. Nora shook her hand, and she was not going to let herself feel how much that sentence cost her to receive. She felt it anyway. She had spent 22 years being processed, placed, reviewed, assessed, graduated through systems that had done their best with what they had, which was a child without context or documentation or anyone to speak for her. Nobody in any of those systems had said welcome to her. The word had a different weight when it came from someone who meant it and had reason to mean it, and she held it quietly as she walked out of the office and down to the street. She had been welcomed. She was the heir. She belonged somewhere specific, to something built by someone who had believed in the future enough to build for it. She walked to the bus stop and stood in the December cold of Portland and waited for the bus back to the depot, and she allowed herself, for exactly as long as the bus took to arrive, to feel the full weight of what had changed. Then the bus came and she got on it, and she went back to work. The appraisal team arrived at the cabin on a Saturday morning in early January for specialists carrying equipment cases through the logging road in gray winter cold. Nora led them. She had described the collection carefully using the inventory notebook, but she had watched each of them absorb her description with the polite reserve of professionals who had learned not to trust clients' accounts of value before seeing the evidence themselves. She pushed through the alder growth at the end of the road, and the clearing opened. Tom Briggs, the estate appraiser, said nothing. Ruth Nakamura, the manuscript expert, stopped walking and just looked at the cabin's proportions and the careful stone foundation before she said anything. Dr. James Okafor, fine art specialist with 30 years at a Seattle museum before private practice, walked directly toward the structure. She opened the ground hatch. They descended. She brought them through the passage and unlatched the interior door. When the motion lights activated in sequence and the shelved rows revealed themselves in controlled LED light, Dr. Priya Mehta said, quietly, and to herself, "Oh." It was a small sound. It reached something in Nora's chest that she had been keeping carefully held since the first morning she had stood in this room alone. The relief of having another person's reaction confirm what she had been carrying by herself for months. The four of them spread through the space without speaking much. Dr. Okafor went to the painting and stood before it at the proper distance with his hands behind his back and did not move for a long time. Ruth Nakamura asked for clean gloves, opened the nearest container, and began her examination with the focused precision of someone who had spent her career handling things that could not be replaced. Nora stood near the door. She had stood in this room many times across the past weeks, with Patricia, with the conservator, with the legal team, and now with the appraisers. Each time it was different. Each time the room was the same, and she was different inside it, carrying a different understanding of what she was looking at and what it meant. The first time she had stood here with her flashlight, she had been alone, and she had not yet read the journal or the letter, and what she felt had been the particular, breathless disorientation of someone encountering something they did not yet have language for. The second time, the morning she came back with the pry bar, she had felt the weight of the Voss letters and the obituary, and the night she had spent running numbers, and the room had felt loaded with implication rather than fact. By the time the appraisers arrived, she had stood here often enough to be past the disorientation and into something quieter. She knew what was in the containers. She had read the documents. She had done the math herself, imperfectly, without professional tools, and had arrived at a range that the appraisers were now going to either confirm or correct. She was not afraid of what they would find. She had stopped being afraid of what was in this room somewhere in the third week of returning to it. What she felt now was something closer to the feeling she had at finishing a very long book, the satisfaction of a thing being what it promised to be, all the way through to the end. This time she stood and watched four strangers encounter what her great-grandfather had built, and she felt the particular quiet satisfaction of watching people who understood what they were seeing encounter it correctly, without reduction, without the adjustments of disbelief. The appraisal took 3 full days. On the afternoon of the third day, the 4 specialists sat around the table with their notes, and Dr. Okafor compiled the totals while the others reviewed their work. He read through each section methodically: the fine art, the manuscripts, the Asian collection, the smaller works and document materials that completed the picture. The painting on the wall was assessed at between $14 and $18 million. A 19th-century German-American landscapist, documented in multiple major collections. Signature confirmed. Date consistent with style and materials. Container 30, the manuscripts, between 60 and 80 million. One item in particular, which Ruth Nakamura described as a 16th-century illuminated text not currently believed to exist in private hands, accounted for more than half that figure on its own. The Asian art section assessed by Dr. Mehta, between 75 and 90 million. 2 pieces in particular were described as likely to provoke significant interest from major institutions on deaccession. The remaining European paintings, document collections, bronze pieces, and ceramics across the remaining containers, a further 160 to 200 million. Dr. Okafor read the final figure aloud without inflection, because it was his practice to deliver numbers without editorial comment, because he understood that a number like this carried its own weight, and adding tone to it would only diminish the clarity of what he was saying. Conservative total, $362 million. High-end total, $403 million. For formal certification, he would apply $380 million as the appraised estate value, representing the center of the assessed range and the most defensible figure in a legal proceeding. $380 million. She wrote it in the notebook in the same column she had been writing inventory numbers in for the past 2 months. A number at the bottom of a page that had started with container descriptions and estimated dimensions and had arrived, through 47 sealed containers and 1 landscape painting and 3 days of expert examination here. She closed the notebook. "Thank you," she said to all 4 of them. Ruth Nakamura said, "I'm glad you found it." She said it simply, the way people said things when they meant them exactly and did not need to say more than the exact thing. The legal process moved at its own pace, which was not fast, but which was steady. Patricia filed the claim in late January. The identity verification was complete by mid-February. The original Voss birth records were in a Portland hospital archive, located by a researcher Patricia had retained. The foster care name change was documented through county records in a chain that was clear and unbroken. Nora Voss, born February 1983, placed as Nora Chun in October 1987 following the death of her parents. Name carried through the system until her emancipation at 18. There was no contest. There was no other heir. The county had no competing claim. The probate process moved through its required steps with the particular smoothness of a case that had been legally prepared for 50 years by a man who had understood that the future did not always arrive on schedule, but that it arrived. Patricia sent updates as each stage cleared. Identity confirmed. Chain of title established. Trust documents authenticated. Claims period closed without challenge. Nora read each update on her phone in the apartment above the hardware store or in the break room at the diner, and each one settled into the pile of things that were now facts, things she had not been able to call facts 2 months ago. She had applied for 3 jobs in Portland, at the Oregon Museum of Art, and at 2 cultural organizations Patricia had mentioned whose work she respected. She had no relevant credentials, and she said so in each application. She described, instead, what she knew, the inventory she had built, the documents she had read, the collection she understood from floor to ceiling. She described her great-grandfather's journal and what it had taught her about why the work of preservation mattered. She sent the applications and did not expect quick responses and was not surprised when she did not receive them. She was not in a hurry. She was thinking, which was something she had rarely had the space to do. The probate judge signed the order on the 28th of February. Patricia called at 7 in the morning and Nora was standing in the apartment above the hardware store, already awake, already dressed, because she had been awake since 4. "It's done," Patricia said. "You're the legal heir. The property, the collection, the trust. It's yours." Nora said thank you and hung up and stood in the apartment for a long moment. She had a cabin in the woods. She had a collection worth $380 million. She had a name that had been waiting for her for 46 years, and a great-grandfather she had never met who had built a lamp in the dark to guide her there. She also had $60 too much in monthly rent that needed to be corrected. She went downstairs. Dennis Farber was rearranging the plumbing aisle with the same deliberate, unhurried manner he always had. She waited until he looked up, and then she told him, with the same quiet plainness she had used 2 months earlier, that she wanted to revisit the rent situation. She put Patricia Solis's card on the counter. Then she put the one-page summary Patricia had prepared, which laid out in plain language the legal outcome, the appraised value, and Nora's confirmed status as the Voss heir. Farber picked it up and read it. He read it a second time. She watched his face move through the process of rearranging what he understood to be true about the woman who lived above his store. It was not dramatic. It was not the expression of someone caught in a wrong. It was a man reading a document and understanding that the ledger he had been working from needed a significant revision. He set the page back on the counter. The rent situation, he said. I'd like it returned to what it was, Nora said. For however long I need the apartment. He said he would adjust the ledger. He said, not quite meeting her eyes, that he was glad things had worked out. She picked up Patricia's card and walked back upstairs and sat on the mattress and looked at the ceiling for a few minutes. She had not done this for Farber. She had not been waiting for his expression to change, or for his apology, or for any acknowledgement from him beyond the practical adjustment of the ledger. She had come downstairs not for the emotional transaction, but for the factual one, because the rent needed to be corrected, and she was the person who could correct it now, and so she had. That was the difference that kept striking her in the days since the court order. She had agency now, not unlimited agency, not the fantasy of a life without constraint, but the specific, concrete ability to correct things that were wrong, to walk into a room where a wrong had been established and change the fact of it. She had never had that before. Not once, in 22 years, had she had the resources and the standing to correct a wrong that had been done to her. She had always had the right. She had lacked the capacity. She did not lack the capacity anymore. She had not done this for Farber. She had not been waiting for his expression to change. But she had stood in the same room where he had told her with efficient certainty that she had no claim, and she had shown him the correction, and that was not triumph. It was just the world returning to its accurate shape, and she had been the one to return it. She told Earl the next morning. Earl read the summary and put it on the counter and was quiet for a long time. I owe you an apology, he said. You were trying to look out for me, Nora said. I was looking out for what made sense to me. He looked at her directly. Those aren't always the same. She accepted the apology simply, without requiring it to be more than it was. He asked if she was leaving the diner. Soon, she said. Not yet. She put on her apron and went to the floor. The regulars across that morning had various reactions, ranging from people who could not quite meet her eyes to a man in the back booth who told her with complete sincerity, when she came to refill his coffee, that he had always known there was something different about her, that he had said so to his wife many times. He said it with no apparent awareness that it was a revision rather than a recollection. She thanked him and kept moving. The town of Grover's Mill was not the problem she was solving. It was just a town for 1,000 people doing what small towns did, which was to make sense of things using the categories they had available and to be wrong sometimes about which category applied. She had not come here to prove them wrong. She had come here because she had run out of bus fare and the diner had an opening. What had happened since was not what anyone in this town had written into their understanding of her. They were rewriting it now, each in their own way, and she had no quarrel with the process. She understood it. She had been rewriting her own understanding of herself for the past several months, and the revision was not yet complete. She was 22 years old, and she owned a cabin in the woods and a collection worth $380 million, and she was refilling coffee cups in a highway diner in a valley town. And all of those things were simultaneously true, and she was going to keep doing the last one until she was ready for the next thing, because readiness was something you owed yourself and could not be rushed. She had thought, in the abstract, about what vindication might feel like. She had grown up reading stories, enough of them to have a shape in mind for the moment when a person who had been dismissed was proven right. She had expected something expansive and hot. She had expected to feel the dismissal in reverse, all that accumulated disregard returning to the people who had delivered it. What she actually felt was much quieter than that. It was not the opposite of being dismissed. It was the absence of needing to be seen at all. She had the facts. She had the documents. She had the number in her notebook and the signed court order and the attorney's card in her jacket pocket. She did not need Grover's Mill to believe her, because Grover's Mill was not the arbiter of what was true. She had known that all along. She was only feeling it now, fully, as the thing it actually was rather than the thing she had been told it was. She kept refilling the coffee cups. She kept taking the orders. She kept doing her job until she was ready for the next thing, and she did not feel the need to announce to anyone what that next thing would be. They would find out when she did it, and that was how it should be. She drove to the cabin one last time as its sole occupant on a Saturday in early March. When the light had shifted from winter gray to something thinner and clearer, the particular quality that came when the sun's angle changed, and the valley began to remember it knew how to be bright. She opened the hatch and descended and came up through the interior door and stood in the controlled air of the cabin with the motion lights activating around her. The shelves were empty. The appraisers had removed the containers for formal documentation, and they were now in professional storage in Portland, waiting for their transfer to the museum. The painting had come off the wall and gone to a conservator for assessment before transport. The room held only its own structure now, the heavy timber shelving, the stone walls behind it, the climate control humming at its steady pitch, and the particular quality of air that had been kept to a specific temperature and humidity for 50 years and had developed a character from that keeping. She walked the perimeter slowly. She had been in conversation for 6 weeks with Dr. Adiz Williams at the Oregon Museum of Art, who had wept carefully and professionally when she first saw the appraisal photographs, and who had spent the subsequent weeks making the case to her board that the museum needed to make this work at whatever terms Nora required. The terms Nora had been working on were specific and binding and designed to outlast everyone currently alive. Not a donation, not a sale, a long-term loan with conditions that held. The collection would remain intact. It would be displayed in a dedicated gallery with its own identity. Free admission for students and minors. Research access for any scholar who requested it, regardless of institutional affiliation or credentials. And a permanent plaque near the entrance, not prominent, but there, stating clearly, collected and preserved by Erich Arnold Voss, 1901 to 1978. Kept by Arthur Pemberton, 1971 to 1999. Returned to the world by Nora Voss, his great-granddaughter. She had written the wording herself. She had sat with a pen for a long time before she wrote it, because she wanted it to be accurate. Not triumphant, not performative, just accurate. The people who had built this collection and the people who had kept it and the person who had finally found it. Those were the facts. The plaque should contain the facts and nothing else. Patricia had said the terms were achievable. Dr. Williams had said they were exactly right. The board had voted to approve the loan arrangement with a speed that Patricia said was unusual for a museum board, and Dr. Williams had said, when she called to relay the news, that she had told the board that this collection had been sealed in a forest for nearly 50 years waiting for someone to treat it properly, and she did not intend to make it wait any longer. Nora had not yet signed the paperwork. She had wanted to stand here one more time in the room as it was, before she released it into what it was going to become. She had also wanted to stand here because she owed the room that. She owed the space and the people whose care had sustained it the acknowledgement of being present in it one last time before everything changed. She had been raised by a system that processed her forward without ceremony, without pausing to mark the transitions, and she had decided, in the years since, to mark the transitions herself when she could. This one deserved to be marked. She stood in front of where the painting had been. The wall behind it was older than the wall beside it. The logs here slightly darker, the surface unmarked except for the 2 small hooks that had held the frame. She looked at the space where the landscape had hung, at the mountains and the complicated sky, and she thought about Erich choosing to hang it directly in the line of sight from the interior door, so that this was the first thing you saw when you came up from the dark passage and into the light. He had done that deliberately. He had stood here and decided, this is the welcome. This is what you see when you arrive. This is the statement the room makes about what it contains and why it was kept. She had understood that, the first morning she stood here with her flashlight, even before she knew who had built it. She had understood it as a decision made by someone who thought about what things meant and what effect they would have on the person who encountered them. She came from someone who thought that way. She was someone who thought that way. She had been thinking that way her entire life without knowing where it came from. Now she knew. She walked to the door and stopped before she opened it. She turned back and looked at the room one more time. The empty shelves, the bare wall, the controlled air holding its temperature, the LED strips running their quiet light over surfaces that held nothing now and would hold nothing again, because their purpose was complete. The collection will keep, Erich had written. Buildings built right keep. He had not been wrong about any of it. The building had kept, through winters and summers and the slow working of wet air and settling soil and the ordinary erosion of time. The collection had kept, in its sealed containers, in its climate-controlled silence, waiting the way things waited when they had been well prepared for waiting. The air had arrived. The lamp had done its work, and the letter had done its work, and the deed of trust had done its work, and the metal box had done its work, and Renata had done her work, and Patricia had done her work, and all of it had converged on a girl walking a road at midnight who stopped and looked. What came next was not keeping but sharing, which was what Erich had always intended, and what Pemberton had understood, and what Clara Brandt had maintained her box against for decades. That was the whole point of the keeping. Not possession, not inheritance in the ordinary sense. Stewardship, temporary and specific, until the world was ready to receive it. The world was ready. She was ready. She opened the door and went back through the passage and up the ladder and out into the clearing. The Oregon Museum of Art opened the Voss collection in November of the same year. Scholars had come from 4 countries. Several hundred members of the public who had read about the story in regional news coverage came to see for themselves what had been sealed in a forest cabin for nearly 50 years. Near the entrance, a girl of maybe 9 or 10 had stopped in front of an illuminated case holding one of the manuscripts and stood perfectly still while her classmates moved around her. Her lips moved slightly as she tried to read the placard. Her teacher touched her shoulder, and she did not notice. Nora watched her from across the gallery. She had been that child. Not in this room, not with this collection, but in the quality of the stillness. In the way the girl was giving an old piece of paper her complete attention as, though nothing else in the building existed. She had been that child in every library she had ever had a card for, in every reading room she had sat in before a shift, running her fingers along spines not to take anything, but just to know they were there. She crossed the gallery to the girl's case. The manuscript inside was the 16th-century illuminated text Ruth Nakamura had assessed as not believed to exist in private hands. It was displayed open to a page showing an illustration so fine and so densely colored that it seemed to generate its own light in the gallery's careful lighting. Red and gold and a blue that the glassmaker had clearly worked hard to achieve. Figures in a border, each one tiny and complete. A sky behind them that had been painted by someone who had looked at actual skies and tried to translate what they saw into a space smaller than a palm. The girl looked up when Nora stopped beside her. "Is it real?" The girl said. "It's real," Nora said. The girl looked at the case again. "How old is it?" "About 500 years. The girl absorbed this. "It looks like somebody worked really hard on it," she said. "They did," Nora said. "They worked incredibly hard on it." She looked at the illustration with the girl for a moment. "That's why we keep it. So you can look at it 500 years later and understand that someone was here, and they made this, and they wanted it to last." The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you make this?" "No," Nora said. "But I brought it here. I made it so you could see it." The girl nodded, as though this was a perfectly ordinary thing. Then she went back to looking at the page. "You could come here any time now. You did not need an invitation. You did not need credentials or money or a last name that connected to anything. You walked through the door and the collection was yours to look at. And that had been made possible by a girl who had once walked past its edge on a cold road at midnight, not knowing it existed." The plaque on the wall near the entrance read, "Collected and preserved by Erich Arnold Voss, 1901 to 1978. Kept by Arthur Pemberton, 1971 to 1999. Returned to the world by Nora Voss, his great-granddaughter." She had written it herself. Patricia had asked what she wanted it to say, and she had sat with a pen for a long time, and this was what she wrote. She stood in the gallery and looked at the people moving through it, at the scholars with their notebooks and the families with their children, and the older men and women who stood before certain pieces for a long time, without saying anything, And she thought about Erich in this room, the room he had imagined but never seen, people encountering what he had made and kept and trusted the future to receive. She thought the room looked exactly the way he had meant it to look. She thought he would have been satisfied. She took the bus back to Grover's Mill that evening. She still had the apartment. She would keep it through the spring, until she had worked out the next thing, which she had not yet worked out and was not rushing. There was money now. Enough to take time. Enough to stop walking this road at midnight in wet sneakers. She walked it anyway. Not from habit. Because she wanted to pass the spot, to stand on the shoulder and understand the tree line from the other side of everything it had started. She reached the section of Kettler Road opposite the 3-1 stand and stopped. The woods were dark. No light showed through the trees. The signal lamp's batteries had been removed months ago, and what had once pulsed amber through the winter dark was now just a small copper fixture on a tree trunk in a cleared forest, needed for nothing. She stood on the road shoulder and looked at the darkness between the trees and felt the particular weight of standing at the end of something that had taken a very long time to finish. Her great-grandfather had lit a lamp in those woods for someone he did not know, because he believed the right person would stop and look. He had been right. He had always been right. The question had only been when. She had stopped and looked. That was all it had taken. That was all it had ever taken. The rest had been patience and stubbornness, and the specific refusal of a person who had been told her whole life that she came from nothing to accept that assessment without first checking the evidence. She stood there a while in the cold and the quiet. Somewhere in the trees, down the logging road she could no longer see, the cabin held its ground in the cleared forest. Empty shelves, bare walls, climate control still running on its automated account. A building that had done exactly what it was built to do. It had kept. It had waited. It had called the right person home. She thought about all the things she had not known, walking this road 6 months ago. She had not known about the collection or the trust or the deed or the attorney or the woman in Portland with a metal box she checked twice a year. She had not known about Erich or Pemberton or Clara Brandt. She had not known about the underground passage or the 47 containers or the painting with the 1887 date in the corner. She had not known she had a family. She had known about the light because she had stopped and looked at it, and she had known to keep looking, and she had known to follow it when it moved, and she had known to go into the woods even when no one in town thought it was worth her time. She had known all of this before she knew anything else, because she had always been the kind of person who paid attention, who noticed things, who stopped for lights in the dark. That was enough. It had been exactly enough. It was all it had ever needed to be. She turned and walked down Kettler Road in the dark, and the gravel crunched under her feet the same way it always had, and the stars were out above the valley in the clean winter sky, and the lights of Grover's Mill sat quiet and small ahead of her, and she walked toward them carrying everything she had now, which was not the same as what she had carried before and never would be again. She had a name that was only hers. She had a family that had reached across 50 years to find her. She had 47 containers of evidence that some people spent their whole lives building something permanent because they believed someone worthy would come to receive it. She had been that someone. She was going home. And for the first time in 22 years, she knew exactly what that meant. She knew what it meant to have come from somewhere specific, from someone who had built with intention and trusted the future to receive it. She knew what it meant to have a name that was not assigned but inherited, not given by a form but carried through blood and time, and the particular faith of a man who had loved the world enough to try to leave it something permanent. She knew what it meant to belong to a story larger than her own survival. She had always been that person. She had just needed to walk down the right road and stop and look. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.